them and everything.
Mm-hmm.
And I did not because they drew them. I did not exactly see them that way, like the cherubim with the wings and everything. I never pictured it that way, but I guess that's what it says. It says it's covering their face. There's two wings that are helping them fly, and then there's two covering their feet.
Yep.
So
it's hard to imagine it, and then some people have an easier time imagining that kind of stuff. And you're like, oh, yeah, I guess that makes sense. So, okay. So as you guys noticed, obviously that video didn't cover all of Isaiah. So when we get to chapter 40, we'll watch the next video in that. Next week, I'm actually going to show you guys a video on biblical poetry. Because there is so much poetry in Isaiah and the prophets and everything else that watching a video on poetry will help you guys be able to walk through that stuff better. And I'm hoping that by next semester we'll actually get into Psalms. So, in any case, it's important to remember that Isaiah spanned a lot of different kings. Okay, so he served under Uzziah, Jotham, Ahaz, Hezekiah, and Manasseh. What do you guys remember about any of those kings? It's been a while, I know. You guys remember anything about any of the kings? Okay. Just to kind of jog our memories a little bit, all right? So Uzziah was made king when he was 16 years old, all right? He actually does a pretty decent job with it, too. Like, as soon as he's made king, he starts going on these military campaigns to start kicking out the foreigners from Israel and Judah where they weren't supposed to be. And so he's kind of restoring the land. And not only does he restore the land from the people, but he starts restoring the land like itself. He starts like doing a lot of cultivation, planting a lot of vineyards. He starts doing a lot of stuff where there's more water coming into the cities and everything. So he does a really good job. And it even says in the text that he actually gets to this point where he starts like designing really creative siege works and other methods to like go against a city to capture it. Okay, but it's this success that leads to his downfall. He gets really proud, and eventually what happens is that he actually goes into the temple and he starts like offering the incense before God. Now, are kings supposed to do that? No. That's the job of the priests. They are the only ones who can act as an intermediary, as a middleman between God and man. And so the priests actually are doing their job, and they come in there and they say, hey, you're not supposed to be in here. You're not supposed to be doing this. And Uzziah, because he's so proud, starts like waving his finger at them and basically saying, you can't tell me what to do. I'm going to do what I want to do. And it's at that moment that God like swoops in and starts plaguing Uzziah with leprosy. And he doesn't realize it until the priests like see this and are terrified, and they grab him and they start like racing him out of the temple. And when he finally realizes what's happened, he's more than happy to leave the temple. And then he ends up living in a separate house for the rest of his life, because you can't leave isolation, quarantine, until you're made clean. And Uzziah never recovered from his leprosy, so he stayed in that house the rest of his life. So his son, as soon as this happened, Jotham takes over. And we don't see much about Jotham. It says that he does a pretty good job. If you guys remember when we did go through the kingdom literature, we talked about how when the text is talking about whether a king was really good or bad, one of the key indicators was, what did they do with the high places? If they left them, they might have been okay, but they didn't do exactly as they were supposed to do. And so Jotham, generally speaking, does a decent job, but he doesn't actually take the high places down. Okay? And I think Jotham's probably got this like almost daily reminder of his dad's experience, and probably has that in the back of his mind while he's serving as king himself. And then his son comes along, Ahaz. Now, Ahaz is just nuts. Okay? Ahaz goes completely against what his fathers have done. He starts bringing in all these idols and gods and everything else. He even goes to the point where he starts sacrificing his children to the fire. Okay? And it gets so bad that Israel and Aram actually, the northern kingdom Israel actually start coming down and raiding Judah. And it comes to a head when Israel actually comes down, and they're actually able to conquer a bunch of the land and take captives, and they take them back up to Samaria, the capital of the northern kingdom. And it's only because a prophet shows up and says, you can't do this. This is wrong. Send these people back. And the leaders actually realize how bad this is, and they tell the military people too. They say, no. We've already messed up enough. Do not bring these people back here, because if we think God's mad at us now, we haven't even begun to see his anger if we keep these our brothers and sisters captive here in Israel. So they send them back. And it's after this act of mercy that Ahaz actually goes and says to the king of Assyria, hey, I want you to get Israel and Aram off my back for me. And Assyria is more than happy to comply. Because what they do is they come in and they take everything out of the temple. Everything of value, they take it out of the temple, and then they go off and they conquer Israel and Aram. And, I mean, it's terrible. Ahaz eventually, after the city in Samaria is sacked, he goes up there and takes an idol from there. Actually, it's from Damascus. He takes an altar from there and says, okay, we're going to rebuild this back in Jerusalem. And then that's when the prophets come up to Ahaz again and say, you've put this altar to a foreign god in God's temple. For this, you're gonna pay. And sure enough, I mean, Ahaz goes even further crazy. He invites more gods into the city. He even actually closes up the temple of God, and eventually is killed, and he moves on. So then we get into Hezekiah, and we've talked about Hezekiah a lot, where Hezekiah really takes his time to clean up the city and everything going on. Like we saw in the video, Assyria comes and tries to attack, and he prays, and they're wiped out. But the Babylonians show up and go from there. Manasseh is the next king, and when Manasseh shows up, Manasseh kind of does like Ahaz. He goes bonkers too, and he starts having all these different gods in the kingdom. And according to Israelite tradition, Manasseh is the king that actually executes Isaiah. And according to the tradition, it's not like he just says, off with your head, or, hangs him or anything like that. He has him sawn in two. Okay? So this is how bad this guy was. But Manasseh's story actually is really interesting, because after Assyria comes to Jerusalem, they actually take him captive, and it's in captivity that he begs for forgiveness and turns his heart, and he's actually restored back to his throne in Jerusalem, and he makes all these reforms to try and bring Jerusalem back to where it's supposed to be. The other thing to understand about Isaiah is that it's the only book that's quoted more than Isaiah in the New Testament is Psalms. So that's saying something for both of these books here about how important these are going to be for our understanding of the New Testament going forward. And that he worked with prophets like Hosea, Amos, and probably Micah. We already went through Micah a little bit, so if you start hearing some stuff that sounds similar to Micah, that'll be why. And then there's a lot of different ways that you could structure this book, but one of the most compelling arguments I've seen is this particular structure here, and it's mainly because in chapters 1 through 35 you've got all this prophecy against not only Jerusalem, but against the rest of the current world around them. Okay? And then in 36 through 39, you have this really brief break where it cuts from the poetic prophecies and it goes into more of a narrative setting. And chapters 36 through 39 really deal with Hezekiah. And then, of course, Isaiah dies under the reign of Manasseh, and chapters 40 through 66 really deal more with the future. Okay? We'll get into that more later, but that's the basic structure there. Like we saw with Jeremiah, we're going to see that there's a lot of messages of judgment, but there's also just as much of a message of hope that we can see in Isaiah as well. So, that being said, let's go ahead and read through Isaiah chapter 1. I think we're starting over here this week. So, Weston, if you'll start us off with Isaiah chapter 1.
2 verses?
Yeah, we'll just keep it 2 verses. Keep it simple.
True. The vision concerning Judah and Jerusalem that Isaiah, son of Amos, saw during the reigns of Uzziah, Jotham, Ahaz, and Hezekiah, kings of Judah. Hear me, you heavens, listen, earth, for the Lord has spoken. I reared children and brought them up, but they have rebelled against me.
The ox knows its master, the donkey its owner's manger, but Israel does not know. My people do not understand. Woe to the sinful nation, a people whose scale is great, a brood of evildoers, children given to corruption. They have forsaken the Lord, they have spurned the Holy One of Israel, and turned their backs on him.
Why should you be beaten in war? Why do you persist in rebellion? Your whole head is injured, your whole heart is afflicted. From the sole of your feet to the top of your head, there is no soundness, and your wounds and welts and open sores, not cleansed or bandaged or soothed with olive oil.
Your country lies in ruins, and your towns are burned. Foreigners plunder your fields before your eyes and destroy everything they see. Beautiful Jerusalem stands abandoned, like a watchman's shelter in winter, like a lean-to in a cucumber field after the harvest, like a hopeless city under
Siege.
Unless the Lord Almighty had left us some survivors, we would have become like Sodom, and we would have been like Gomorrah. Hear the word of the Lord, you rulers of Sodom. Listen to the instruction of our God, you people of Gomorrah.
Multitude of your sacrifices, what are they to me, says the Lord? I have more than enough of for offering the rams and the fat of fattened animals. I have no pleasure in the blood of the bull and lambs and goats. When you come to appear before me, who has asked this of you, the trampling of my court?
Bring no more vain offerings. Incense is an abomination to me. New moon and Sabbath and the calling of convocations. I cannot endure iniquity and solemn assembly. Your new moons and your appointed feasts my soul hates. They have become a burden to me. I am weary of bearing them.
When you spread out of your hands in your prayer, I hide my eyes from you. Even when you offer many prayers, I am not listening. Your hands are full of blood. Wash and make yourselves clean. Take your evil deeds out of my sight. Stop me. Learn to do right. Seek justice. Defend the oppressed. Take up the cause of the fatherless. Plead the cause of the widow. Come now, let us settle the matter, says the Lord. Though your sins are like scarlet, they shall be white as snow. Though they are as red as crimson, they shall be like wool.
If you are willing and obedient, you will eat the good things of the Lord. But if you resist and rebel, you will be devoured by the sword. For the mouth of the Lord has spoken.
See how the faithful city has become a prostitute. She once was full of justice, righteousness used to dwell in her, but now murderers. Your silver has become dross, your choice wine is diluted with water. Your rulers are rebels, partners with thieves. They all love bribes and chase after gifts. They do not defend the cause of the fatherless. The widow's case does not come before them. Therefore the Lord Almighty, the Mighty One of Israel declares, I will vent my wrath on my foes and avenge myself on my enemies. I will turn my hand against you. I will thoroughly purge away your dross and remove all your impurities. I will restore your leaders as in days of old, your rulers as at the beginning. Afterward you will be called the city of righteousness, the faithful city. Zion will be delivered with justice, her penitent ones with righteousness. The rebels and sinners will both be broken, and those who forsake the Lord will perish. You will be ashamed because of the sacred oaks in which you have delighted. You will be disgraced because of the gardens that you have chosen. You will be like an oak with fading leaves, like a garden without water. The mighty man will become tinder, and his work a spark. Both will burn together. with no one to quench the fire. Alright. Anything in there in particular that caught your attention, seemed really confusing?
Well, I have to say, what I found interesting from what I read, he's talking about all their things that they were told to do, atonements, trumpets, all of the festivals, and he says they're an abomination to me. And I don't, what's interesting to me is that atonements is their main part of the year where they are coming to God and saying, okay, we messed up, and we're asking for your forgiveness again.
Mm-hmm.
And if God's saying that this is an abomination to me, I can't handle this, then basically he's saying, you're not doing anything by doing this.
Yeah.
And I can't forgive you.
Yeah.
So it's kind of like he reached a dead end point. Like, you've gone too far now.
Well, yeah, and I mean, we'll get into that more in a little bit, but I mean, it's realistically a matter of the people have. I mean, they're bringing all these sacrifices to him, but are they sincere? Are they sincerely offering sacrifices? No. They know that part of the life that they have as Jews is to sit there and go to the temple and to offer sacrifices and all this other different stuff, but they've forgotten that a critical part of this is confession. And turning from that, and so we'll get into that more later. But yeah. One thing to be aware of as we go into Isaiah and the prophetic literature and such is that you're going to see a lot of courtroom style language. Okay, and it's because God's calling the people to account. Okay, so when God says in verse 2, "Hear me, you heavens; listen, earth, for the Lord has spoken," He's calling his witnesses into the courtroom, basically. And he's getting ready to pronounce the judgment. So in verses 2 through 3, one thing that you can notice as you're going through this to keep in mind is that duplication is really critical. If you're reading through something in biblical poetry and you see them continuously repeat the point, that means it's something that they're really trying to emphasize. Okay? So, for example, in verses 2 through 3, he says, I reared children and, the ox knows its master, the donkey knows its owner's manger. But Israel does not know, my people do not understand. He's repeating that point, in the first and second parts there. And really what he's saying is that animals know their own masters. But my people won't even listen to me. The oxen knows how to follow its master, but my people just rebel. They don't care. And so this is the point that he's getting at there. Verses 5 through 9, God's trying to tell the people that he's offered them grace by punishing them. Okay? Go back to that. Why should you be beaten anymore? Why do you persist in rebellion? Your whole head is injured. Your whole heart is afflicted. From the sole of your foot to the top of your head there is no soundness, only wounds and welts and open sores, not cleansed or bandaged or soothed with olive oil. Okay? Do you guys remember what Paul said about punishment or discipline in Romans? Is discipline God's way of saying he despises us? What is God saying when he disciplines? I love you. Okay? When God disciplines, it's his way of saying, I love you, I want you to stop what you're doing, and I want you to come back. And so when God is saying here, there's no soundness on your body. You're covered in bruises and beatings and everything else. What he's saying is that I have continuously tried to discipline you. I've continuously tried to bring you back to me, but you won't listen. And so what does Paul say is God's way of saying, I'm done? His wrath is shown in what? Absence. His wrath is shown in absence. Okay? When God says, I'm done, he steps away and he walks off. That's when he's showing his wrath. Okay? And so this is what he's saying right here in this part of the text. He's saying, I keep beating you, but you're not listening. They keep trying to go to all these other foreign gods to get their land, to get a harvest, or to get their safety and all this other different stuff. And God's sitting here saying, all right, you want to trust in this foreign God to provide for your harvest? I'm going to take away your harvest just so you can see that guy's bunk, that he's not going to do anything. You want to trust in this guy to save you from military campaigns? I'm going to take away all your protection, and I'm going to let people come in and hurt you so you can see there's no trust in this God. He's not real, but they don't want to believe. Verses 11 through 20, God's saying, and this is what Jeff was kind of hitting at right there, was that God's saying he doesn't just want sacrifices. The whole idea of the sacrificial system is to recognize that you've messed up and that you need something to cover over your sin. God provides a sacrificial system because something has to die in order to cover over the sin. Okay? But the people aren't really giving up their sin. All they're really doing is saying, oh, okay, well, it's that time of year again, and they're showing up and they're sacrificing animals, and that's all that they're doing. But this isn't just an Old Testament problem. It's not just a problem that the Jews of the New Testament were going through, even though they did it too. This is a problem with God's people in general. Because there's a ton of times when we do the same exact thing. When we aren't willing to give up the sin in our life, we're not really doing transformation that God is asking for. This is the whole idea, is that God has asked us to be transformed into his image, and part of that, yes, requires the sacrifice so that we can have our sin covered over, but the other part of that is that we are being changed from that sinful nature. Jesus' sacrifice makes us holy, but he also does that by transforming the sinful nature out of us so that we can be restored to where we need to be, which is God's nature. Verse 21, Israel's supposed to be this example to the world, and instead they look exactly like it. In some cases, they look worse than the world. Okay? And so Isaiah is trying to tell the people, look, you guys have just completely failed. You are supposed to be the shining example to the world of what God's life is supposed to look like, and instead, all you've done is just the exact same thing as the rest of them. And then in verses 22 and 25, he makes this really interesting point here. He says that they view their silver as precious, and yet he calls it worthless. And so he's saying that everything worthless will be burned off. When he talks about the dross being burned off, that's what he's saying. And so, they've come to value that their money and everything else is something that's precious to them, that's important. And he's trying to say, what you're saying is important is garbage. It doesn't matter. This is what Solomon kept trying to say in Ecclesiastes was, look, I tried to find pleasure in money. I tried to find pleasure in sleeping around. I tried to find pleasure in everything else in this world, and nothing mattered. It was all meaningless. The only thing that mattered was obedience to God. And yet they're still stuck on the silver and the gold. Before we close out for the morning, I want you guys to see this in chapters 2 through 4. So one of the guys that I was studying from talked about how there's almost an architectural nature to the way that Isaiah writes. Do you guys remember what we said about the capstone? Do you guys remember what the capstone is?
Isn't that the finishing stone on a pyramid?
It can be the finishing stone on a pyramid. It can be the finishing stone in an arch. What's the purpose of the capstone? To hold it up, yeah. So you've got all this weight being built up in an arch or in a building or whatever, and the capstone is designed so that as these two pieces come together, they don't just topple in on each other, and the capstone keeps the weight. Okay? And so what's really interesting is the way that chapters 2 through 4 is designed. Okay? So in chapter 2, verses 2 through 5, he talks about the hope of Israel. He comes back to this in verse 2 through 6. And so it's almost like he's building this foundation. Okay? And then he's saying in chapter 2, verses 6 through 22, and then in chapter 3, verses 2 through chapter 4, verse 1, he builds up this condemnation, this indictment against Judah and Israel. Okay? And then if you look in chapter 3, verse 1, he says something really interesting. Somebody read that for me real quick. Well, here, I'll just let you guys listen since I just saved some time. But see if you can understand why this is significant. All right, see now the Lord Almighty is about to take from Jerusalem and Judah both supply and support, all supplies of food and all supplies of water. What did he say he was taking away?
All supplies of food and water.
All supplies and... both supply and support. So right in the literary spot where the capstone should be, Isaiah has God saying, I'm taking it away. Right where the central part of it should be, where everything should come together, he's saying, you don't have support. I'm taking it away. Everything that you have is going to fall. And what's left is the foundation. And what do we say the foundation is? Not the capstone. What's the foundation? Hope for Israel. That's the foundation. And so he's saying he is taking everything else away, but the foundation is going to stand, and that's hope. And that's what we'll get more into as we go through Isaiah. So, for this week, God wants us to be a light to the world around us. When we rebel, he's going to try to punish us and bring us back, but he isn't beyond cutting off unfruitful branches. And he talks about that Paul talks about that in Romans as well. So, alright, so today we got lunch after morning worship with the prime timers and singles. And then after that, come right back over here and we'll have the parent meeting real quick. And then we're going to go from there up to Clovis for paintball. It's $21 to get everything there on site. And then you'll need a parent signed release form. Does everybody have that? Alright. Yeah. Alright. If you need one, I'll get one printed out for you. And we can go from there. But if you've got a friend that's going to be